Hello, my name is Dr. David Ghobrial, and I'll be doing a tutorial on the clotting cascade. So the coagulation cascade is a high-yield topic for a lot of licensing exams, and I found a lot of helpful videos out there from medical students and physicians, but I really wanted something with a story so it can help me remember where everything fits. So I'm going to do a simple drawing of the clotting cascade with a story in order to help you remember, and I hope you can remember the clotting cascade and answer as many questions as possible because you can remember and recall the clotting cascade. Now the coagulation cascade is actually the story that I came up with, because the coagulation cascade starts with the factor 12. I tried to think hard of a story, and I came up with the story of Joseph and his 11 brothers. It's a common known Sunday school story, so if you know it, it's going to help you a lot. If you don't, then it's a good time to brush up on your Sunday school stories, learn an interesting story, and learn the coagulation cascade as well. So we start with activated platelets. So activated platelets start us off here, and this, we can say this is Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons. So factor 12 becomes activated to factor 12A. Now the 12 sons of Jacob right off the bat have only 11 working in the field, because the youngest, his mother, dies in childbirth, and Benjamin doesn't work the fields. So there's only 11 brothers working the field. So factor 11 becomes activated to factor 11A. Now, when the 11 brothers are working the field, one of them is Joseph, and Joseph is very special to his father, and he's dependable, and he's becomes his father's favorite right away. And his father sets him above all his brothers, makes him in charge. The problem is that his brothers are getting jealous of him. Now Joseph starts having these dreams of him ruling over his brothers, these prophetic dreams, and so his brothers get more jealous of him. So they plot against him, and they throw him down a well, and then they sell him to traders as a slave, and then they go back to the father and tell him that he was eaten by wild animals. And his father is so much grief that he decides to live in grief for the rest of his life. And Judah, the fourth eldest of his brothers, can't live with all this grief and guilt, so he decides to leave camp and go work somewhere else. So the 11 brothers become 9 brothers working the field, with Joseph gone, and with Judah going to leaving and starting his own camp. This is up to here. This is actually our, I'm going to put right here, that this is our intrinsic pathway. So the intrinsic pathway is, we can think of it as a road on the highway, and there's it's going to join the common pathway down here, and so we're going to put here common pathway. And there's another road that's going to join it from here, and that's the extrinsic pathway. So the intrinsic pathway ends up with just the story of Joseph going to Egypt and Judah leaving. So the 9 brothers become working in the fields by themselves. Now what happens is a terrible famine happens, something very drastic. Just like in the story, our story, there's a climax, a beginning of the story, a climax of the story, and an ending, a conclusion. So a climax here sets the stage for a major event here. So what happens when we know that Joseph is sent to Egypt? When he's in Egypt, he lives as a slave for a while, then he becomes falsely accused of rape and sent to prison for another while, and then he interprets the Pharaoh's dream and becomes in charge of all Egypt as the second most powerful man in the world. So the initiation of this is he has a dream of a terrible, or the Pharaoh gets a dream of a terrible famine that's about to happen. So you can remember terrible famine, which is tissue factor. So the terrible famine can always remind you of tissue factor. The tissue factor here is, or the terrible famine is a famine for 7 years. You can remember that from the story, that 7 years are the terrible famine that happens. Or you can remember that in the dream, there is a dream of 7 years of plenty that turned to 7 years of famine. So the terrible famine, or the tissue factor over here, initiates the factor 7 in our coagulation cascade, from 7 years of plenty to 7 years of famine. Now, the 7 years of famine join, this is the end of the extrinsic pathway, and join the common pathway. The 7 years of famine makes all the brothers return back and work together. So, the 10 brothers working together. Now, we're going to make a step back in our story. Here, when all the brothers are working together, minus Judah and Joseph, you can remember the 2 J's, Judah and Joseph, are missing. So the 9 brothers, they are wealthy, there's no famine, so they can all each afford to have a companion or a working donkey to help them. But not all of them, because we can't use the 9 again. So we're going to use factor 8, because all minus, except the youngest, get to have their own donkeys. So factor 8 here is a cofactor for the 9 brothers, helping the 9 brothers. Now, this is a catastrophic event here in history that happens. A terrible famine happens, the 7 years of famine start, and the 10 brothers decide to go back together, to work together. So we're going to actually put all the factors around that initiate the 10 brothers returning in a circle, because it's very important. And not only that, but the preceding factors and the factors also to follow. Now, how do we get to know which number to follow? Now, we continue in our story, that's how we know. And the common pathway is speaks about also the number of brothers, but the number of brothers that are in Egypt. So it happens when they all go back together, they try to weather the famine together, but the famine lasts for so long that they can't wait it out. So they decide to go back to Egypt and learn and buy more grain. And buy more grain from Egypt. So they turn to go to Egypt, and they go and meet Joseph where they don't recognize him and ask him to buy grain from Egypt. But Joseph recognizes his brothers right away and decides to test them and see if they will listen to him or not, or would betray their owner or not again. So Joseph decides to tell them that he believes that they are spies sent to spy out the land, and the only way they can prove their story, right, if they can go back and the 10 brothers can return back to Canaan and bring back Benjamin, the missing brother. They at first object to that, and then he forces them to go back, but he says, I will keep one brother with me here in Egypt in order to prove your story, or keep you coming back. So only 2 brothers are left in Egypt. Joseph, under disguise, unknown, and Simeon are both left in Egypt. And we're going to circle this factor as well, because it's the preceding factor to the climax of our story. Now, they all return to Canaan, and bring back Benjamin and return back to Egypt. When they're in Egypt, Joseph reveals himself to them and says, I am Joseph, your missing brother, and I want to keep you all here, and I want you to go back first and bring all your families and our brother and our father Jacob. I want to take care of you for the rest of the famine and have you live here in Egypt with me. So they all return back, and only Joseph is left in Egypt. But they return back And so all the brothers are back together, plus their sister Dina. So they become 13. 13 becomes 13a. So the last factor is 1a over here. Now all the factors that are in the story here that we have circled need, so all factors in the circle need vitamin K. So you got to remember all these factors in the circle, those 4 factors, all need vitamin K. Now, we have some cofactors. When the brothers work together over here, because of the famine, they can't afford to all have their 8 donkeys anymore. They only can afford each 2 to share a donkey. And over here, we've said that the cofactor here is the 13 brothers plus the 12 brothers plus the sister. That's 13 siblings. Now let's apply this story to some questions. Now, the terrible factor is the initiator for the extrinsic pathway. And as you can see, the extrinsic pathway after the terrible famine or tissue factor has only one factor, so it's the short pathway. So the short pathway gets tested by the short PT, and the long pathway over here gets tested by PTT. That's one example here.